So, a very good afternoon to all of you present here. I, Dr. Krishna Sinhamahapatra, welcome you to the second lecture on the lecture series titled Non-Fictional Prose for UGC NET Set Examination conducted by BARTI Pune. So, in the previous lecture, we have got an introduction about the idea of non-fictional prose, and today we are going to take it ahead through discussion of certain other texts. So as I said, it is the lecture number 2, which we are going to deal with today. And quickly we'll revise the important points which we need to have understanding of in order to follow the lecture 2. Those who have missed the first lecture, it is available in BARTI's online channel, that is BARTI Online. You can refer back to it as well. Just a minute. Some network problem again. So I will share my screen once again and let us see if it works. Yes, so it's working. So, as we said, that the basic idea we are having on non-fictional prose discussion, and the basic idea of this is that when we are saying it's a non-fiction, we actually mean a literary work, definitely, that is based mainly on fact, even though it may contain fictional elements. Examples are the essay and biography. So basically, the most important thing, as we have already discussed, we have understood, and we are trying to emphasize on it once again, is that a literary work which is based on fact makes or is the part of the very basic framework of non-fictional prose. And fiction refers to literature, wherein mysteries, science fiction, romance, fairy tales, and criminal thrillers are all called fiction. And when we are saying non fiction, we are talking about something which is not fiction, which is very much evident from the name itself. And we are going to kind of understand that further. So, again, the idea of fact, and it is a very broad category of literature, as we have discussed in the previous lecture, and we specifically took up some of the Indian context references and how nonfiction has grown in the Indian context. So it is a very broad category of literature, and the Department of Excellence has books and videos in many categories, including biography, business, cooking, health and fitness, pets, art, home decoration, languages, travel, home improvement, religion, arts and music, history, self help, true crime, science, and comedy. That is what comes when we talk about the idea nonfiction. When we talk about the idea of prose, prose, as we understand, is a type of language that does not have an official metric structure. It uses the flow of speech naturally, as well as the general structure of the system, rather than the rhythm structure as in the traditional poetry. So, general structure which it follows is the structure of a speech rather than rhythm. Now, the types which can be included are there on your screen, which we have discussed in details earlier. And I had asked you to actually do this homework, so I'm just repeating, which you need to do some examples of academic paper, creative nonfiction, academic publishing, almanac, that is again a collection of writing based on a certain topic, autobiographies, referring to the Dalit autobiographies or autobiographies of writers over the ages, Then another important was encyclopedia, how there are different references to it, and how there are different diaries, personal diaries, which have later been published as novels, which are important and we need to refer to them. Then history, as we were talking about history, the idea of chronicles, how chronicles were important. As we started our discussion, we have discussed about the different chronicles, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle and the different chronicles which were there existing at the very beginning, and then journals, then letter, how letter, because earlier the only means of communication was letter, and through letter we could actually communicate. For example, Gandhiji's communication with Dr. Ambedkar, or Dr. Ambedkar's communication with anybody else, so those letters can also be considered as piece of literature, and they can be considered as non-fiction. Then literary criticism, then miscellany, natural history, philosophy, popular science, self-help books, science books, scientific paper, statutes, textbooks, wherein there are different textbooks based on different data and different references. So, what kind of textbooks are there? Then, different travelogues, which we have seen that various travelogues are also important, just like we have travel vlogs now. Earlier, there were only travelogues which could be referred to. Now, pre independence works we have already discussed in the previous lecture. And we quickly just went through post independence prose. So we will just focus a little on this and then move ahead with some important texts for today. So S. Radhakrishnan taught philosophy at leading universities in India and abroad and rose to be President of India. He was a prolific writer whose works include Indian philosophy. So we have discussed that philosophy is an important part of non-fiction. The Hindu view of life, the principal Upanishads. Khushwant Singh, next, better known as novelist and journalist, has the credit of writing standard scholarly work on his community. So, scholarly work on his community. When you're writing about reality, you're writing about facts. As we know, it becomes a part of non-fiction. Now, the leading critics in the field of Indian English literature are K.R.S. Srinivas Iyengar and C.D. Narasimhaya and M.K. Nayak. Then Meenakshi Mukherjee is another important critic whose The Twice Born fiction is devoted to Indian English fiction in realism and reality. She studies the growth of novel in Indian languages. So when you are actually doing some research, you're publishing it and you're writing it in prose, you're writing it as a factual data, and hence it is becoming a part of non-fiction. A writer of the post independence era who resembles Chaudhary in dedicating himself to non fictional writing is Ved Mehta, author of 18 books, of which just one, The Delinquent Chacha, is a novel. So, other than this, the others are examples of non fictional writing of Ved Mehta. Then R.K. Lakshman, India's best cartoonist, has published the autobiography, which is The Tunnel of Time, and many English, or rather established, we could say, novelists have published their autobiographies, like Nayanthara Sehgal's Prison and Chocolate Cake, which appeared before her novel was followed by From Fear Set Free. So there are not only these, but there are many other autobiographies. If you actually, which I have asked you to just write down the autobiographies of important writers, and which are based on their own growth and their own life story, you can actually refer to them to get an idea of how the trajectory of nonfiction looks like. Now we have come to travelogues. So many leading novelists have written travelogues. R.K. Narayan's The Emerald Route takes us all over Karnataka, while his dateless diary is about his visit to USA. Many novelists of the new generation have written travelogues. Then Salman Rushdie's The Jaguar's Smile describes his visit to Nicaragua. Then you must have read Ruskin Bond. So Ruskin Bond's writings, like Rain in the Mountains, uh, are based on his stay in Dehradun. He had visited England, and his experience of England also he has put down in his writings. So there are many autobiographical elements in Ruskin Bond's writings also. So the autobiographical writings which kind of bring down the idea of, or brings us to the idea of non-fiction. Now, the personal essay is a very popular prose form. Indians have not lagged behind in practicing it. These light essays are generally published in newspapers or journals, but there are many collections of lasting literary merit, and many collections of R.K. Narayan's essays have appeared, such as Next Sunday and A Writer's Nightmare. So, personal essay is about writing on particular topics which you wish to write, and so these light essays, essay writing, I think everyone has done in school, because it is one of the important ways of assessing students, wherein your creativity is analyzed, your English skills are analyzed. So personal essays are a practice of right, which is practiced by many people. So there are many collections of lasting literary merit in this genre, which are light personal essays, and they are published in newspapers or journals. And the example which you can keep in mind is R.K. Narayan's essays, such as Next Sunday and A Writer's Nightmare. So when you are actually writing about your kind of experience and putting it in the form of writing which resembles everyday speech, which resembles writing down a thesis, which resembles writing, not about the poetic quality, but rather about the factual documentation which is happening, is what makes it an example of non-fiction. Now we are going to take up certain important works which are to be studied, along with the different examples of non-fiction which we have already discussed, and you need to make a note of examples of each for better understanding. The first writer whom we are going to discuss is Francis Bacon. So Sir Francis Bacon, later Lord Verulam and Viscount St. Albans, was an English lawyer, statesman, essayist, historian, intellectual reformer, philosopher, and champion of modern science. Now, early in his career, he claimed all knowledge as his province, and afterwards dedicated himself to a wholesale revaluation and restructuring of traditional learning. So, all knowledge is his province. This is what he had claimed earlier. And later on, he dedicated himself to a wholesale revaluation and restructuring of traditional learning. To take the place of the established tradition, a miscellany of scholasticism, humanism, and natural magic, he proposed an entirely new system based on empirical and inductive principles and the active development of new arts and inventions, a system whose ultimate goal would be the production of practical knowledge for the use and benefit of men and the relief of the human condition. So, early in his career, what did he claim? That all knowledge is his province. And afterwards, he dedicated himself to a wholesale revaluation and restructuring of traditional learning. As it is happening now, we are seeing that National Education Policy 2020 is kind of redesigning our method of studying, our method of syllabus and studies in general. So he was also doing revaluation and restructuring of traditional learning to take the place of established tradition, a miscellany of scholasticism and humanism and natural magic. So he proposed an entirely new system based on empirical and inductive principles, and the active development of new arts and inventions is what he focused. So a system whose ultimate goal would be the production of practical knowledge. So it was focusing on what? It was focusing on practical knowledge for the use and benefit of men and the relief of the human condition. So this entire restructuring and revaluation of traditional learning was done with the focus of having or producing practical knowledge for the use and benefit of men and the relief of the human condition. Now, as a work of narrative fiction, Bacon's novel, and the name of the novel, The New Atlantis, may be classified as a literary rather than a scientific or philosophical work, though it effectively belongs to both categories. So it belongs, it's an intersection of both categories, and the categories are scientific or philosophical work as well as a literary. So, as a literary plus a scientific or philosophical work, though it effectively belongs to both the categories. So, according to Bacon's amanuensis, that is a literary assistant who takes down the notes and important points, and first biographer William Raleigh, the novel represents the first part, showing the design of a great college or institute devoted to the interpretation of nature, of what was to have been a longer and more detailed project, depicting what? Depicting entire legal structure and political organization of an ideal commonwealth. So the work thus stands in the great tradition of the utopian. Utopian, the name suggests, a place which is possible in imagination, something not in reality. So utopian philosophical novel. So what kind of novel? An utopian philosophical novel that stretches from Plato and More to Huxley and Skinner. So the work stands, that is an example of the great tradition of what? Of utopian philosophical novel, and the time span stretches from Plato and More to Huxley and Skinner. Now the thin plot or fable is little more than a fictional shell to contain the real meat of Bacon's story. So the fictional shell, it's an outer covering. So if you think of an egg, and how the outer covering is only protecting something which is inside it, so is a little more than a fictional shell to contain the real meat of Bacon's story. And what is that? The elaborate description of Solomon's house, also known as the College of the 6 Days Works, a centrally organized, just a minute. Yes. So the thin plot or fable is little more than a fictional shell to contain the real meat of Bacon's story. Real meat in the sense, the real essence, the main idea, the main focal point of Bacon's story. So, description of Solomon's house, also known as College of the 6 Days Work, a centrally organized research facility where specially trained teams of investigators collect data, conduct experiments, and most importantly, from Bacon's point of view, apply the knowledge they gain to produce things of use and practice for man's life. So the new arts and invention they eventually share with the outside world. So what do they share with the outside world? They share the new arts and the inventions is shared with the outside world. In terms of its sci-fi adventure elements, that is the science fiction adventure elements, the New Atlantis is about as exciting as a government or university reorganization plan. What? A government or university reorganization plan. But in terms of its historical impact, the novel has proven to be nothing less than revolutionary, having served not only as an effective inspiration and model for the British Royal Society, but also as an early blueprint and prophecy That is, it gave an idea, it created a model, it showed a model to the world. What model? Of modern research center and international scientific community. So, an early blueprint and prophecy of the modern research center and international scientific community. So the novel has proven to be nothing less than what? Nothing less than revolutionary, having served not only as an effective inspiration and model for the British Royal Society, but also an early blueprint and prophecy. Prophecy means what? You are guessing about something. You are making a prediction, rather, we would say, a wise prediction about the future. So it is, or it was, an example of blueprint and prophecy of the modern research center and international scientific community. Now we come to his next work, which is also very, very important. That is the Great Instauration. So, as early as 1592, in a famous letter to his uncle Lord Burghley, Bacon declared all knowledge to be his province and vowed his personal commitment to a plan for the full scale rehabilitation and reorganization of learning. So, as early as 1592, in a famous letter to his uncle Lord Burghley, Bacon declared all knowledge. If you remember, we started with this discussion that initially Bacon had thought that all knowledge is his province, and then slowly he moved on to do what? He moved on to restructure the idea of knowledge and learning. So here also in his letter to Lord Burghley, his uncle, he is writing that all knowledge is his province, and he vowed his personal commitment to a plan for the full scale rehabilitation and reorganization of learning. Now, in effect, he dedicated himself to a long term project of intellectual reform, and the balance of his career can be viewed as a continuing effort to make good on that pledge. So, So, in effect, he dedicated himself to a long term project of the intellectual reform, as we were saying, that he is constantly trying to reconfigure, reform, and bring about new changes in the field of intellectual studies, in the field of knowledge. So, he dedicated himself to a long term project of the intellectual reform, and the balance of his career can be viewed as a continuing effort to make good on that pledge. So his career, that is whatever he has done, is basically an example of making good on that pledge, the pledge about creating something related to intellectual reform. Now, in 1620, while he was still at the peak of his political success, he published the preliminary description and plan for an enormous work that would fully answer to his earlier declared ambitions. So, whatever his earlier declared ambitions were that all knowledge is his province, and the fact that he is going to restructure the idea of knowledge. So he, when in 1620 he was still at the peak of his political success, he published the preliminary description and plan for an enormous work that would fully answer to his earlier declared ambitions of being the head of all knowledge. The work dedicated to James was to be called Magna Instauratio, that is the grand edifice or great instauration. When we are saying instauration in the sense kind of restoring something to the main or actual idea, right? So this was what he was talking about, the great instauration, which is about restoring or renewing something which is already there. So his main effort was renewing the whole idea and restoring the idea of knowledge. So, and it would represent a kind of summa, that is a summary or culmination of uh, what? The culmination. of this whole idea, which is about Bacon's thought on subjects which are ranging from logic and epistemology. In Bacon's day was called natural philosophy, the word science being then but a general synonym for wisdom or learning. So it would represent a kind of summa or culmination of all Bacon's thought on subjects ranging from logic and epistemology to practical science, wherein epistemology itself talks about the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. So he's talking about subjects which are ranging from logic and then epistemology about knowledge to practical science, or what Bacon's during time his time was called natural philosophy, the word science being then but a general synonym for wisdom or learning. So the concept of science which we have now was not it was not used in the same sense during that time. And in Bacon's day, science was termed as natural philosophy. So we see that he was actually covering the range of entire what comes under the ambit of knowledge and epistemology or studies. So he was actually covering these entire things through his study, which in itself is a very, very big thing to do, a very big task to undertake. Like several of Bacon's projects, the instauration in its contemplated form was never finished. Now, you can understand, if the work which you take up is so huge in nature, then it is something which becomes very difficult to finish. So the instauration in its contemplated form was never finished. It was not possible to finish it. Now, of the intended 6 parts, only the first 2 were completed, while the other portions were only partly finished or barely begun. So he had intended, that is, he had wished to write how many parts? 6 parts. Only the first 2 parts of all these 6 parts were completed, and other portions were partly finished or barely begun. Now, consequently, eventually, the work as we have it is less like the vast but well sculpted monument that Bacon envisioned than a kind of philosophical miscellany or grab bag. So, part 1 of the project, De Dignite et Augmentis Scientiarum, 9 books of the dignity and advancement of learning, was published in 1623. It is basically an enlarged version of the earlier Proficience and Advancement of Learning, which Bacon had presented to James in 1605. So, what did Bacon do? So, Bacon had written, so the work which is, we have it, is less like the vast but well sculpted monument that Bacon had dreamed of creating. So, part 1 of the project, that is 9 books of the dignity and advancement of learning, was published in 1623. An enlarged version of the earlier Proficience and Advancement of Learning, which he had actually presented to James in 1605. Part 2, that is Novum Organum or New Organon, provides the author's detailed explanation of the correct procedure for interpreting nature. You must have heard this name Novum Organum because of its significance, wherein he is, detailed explanation or demonstration of what? Of the correct procedure for what? For interpreting nature. So it first appeared in 1620. Now, together, these 2 works present the essential elements of what? Of Bacon's philosophy. including most of the major ideas and principles that we have come to associate with the terms Baconian and Baconianism. So, together these two works present what? Present the essential elements of Bacon's philosophy. So, if we have to know about Bacon's philosophy, we have to read these works. And these works play an important role to actually understand what Bacon envisioned to do, what his plan was, and what kind of changes and restructuring he wanted to bring about in the entire study of epistemology, science, and logic in general. So, what are the two works? Novum Organum and the one which he had written earlier, that is the 9 books of the dignity and advancement of learning, which was basically an enlarged version of proficiency and advancement of learning. Now we move on to the next writer whom we are going to read, that is Robert Burton and his work, The Anatomy of Melancholy. So, this is one of the first treatises on melancholy. So, it is basically a treatise. This is a write up on the topic of melancholy. So, in contemporary language, called emotional depression. So, what is it? It is called emotional depression. That is the anatomy of melancholy. Melancholy is a condition that can be less severe than clinical depression or as bad. So, melancholy has diverse causes and variety of treatments and cures are available. So, basically, being sad or emotionally depressed is something which melancholy talks about. So, it's a condition that can be less severe than what? Than clinical depression or as bad. So, a diverse causes and variety of treatments can be there in order to cure you of your situation of melancholy. And depression is such a very, very common and evident example in and around us now. So, the author writes about this. This book is highly unusual in that the original author lived from 1577 to 1640 AD in England. Now, during the introduction, it is explained that this treatise is more of a composite than an original work in the pure sense of the term. So, it is a blend of the science of the day which had not yet separated into different branches. So, it is a blend of the what? Of the science of the day which had not yet separated into different branches. That this treatise is what is more of a composite than an original work in the pure sense of the term, and it is a blend of the science of the day which had not yet separated into different branches. There is a lack of knowledge of many things, but the approach towards the cure is holistic. So there is lack of knowledge of many things, but the approach towards the cure is what? It is a holistic approach. Robert Burton is more a scholar and librarian than either a scientist or physician. So the work seems to run gambit from entirely serious to less so. It is written in the manner of a thorough treatise upon a given topic, in contrast to anything less complete and exhaustive. The author is known to have modified and appended much that had already been written, and this was the normal way to update works at the time, the insertion of newer materials mixed in with the old. So it was a very genuine and kind of already existing strategy of that time, wherein if there was already an existing body of knowledge on a particular topic, then a writer could actually kind of update that work and insert new materials which would dwell with the existing old materials in that particular work. So the author uses the main resources made available to him for the book. So these show the traditions of knowledge that are prevalent and competing with each other at the time. So one of these is that the author has great respect for what? For astrology, but is well aware that this system had fallen out of favor. So he is an educated man living in a Christianized world, And then he has knowledge of many of the great physicians of history and realizes that readers might respect these references more. As such, he provides information about these and about supernatural sources and insights suggested by the philosophers. Hence, he covers the main trends in knowledge and the application of it in this compendium of insight and instruction into the world of melancholia. So, we have to remember the world which is directed here is the world of melancholia, and the area which is covered is covered the main trends in knowledge and the application of it in this compendium of what, of insight and instruction. So insight and instruction is given, and given in order to create this world of kind of, create solutions for this world of melancholia, or how to deal with the situation of being in melancholy. So that is what Robert Burton's uh, idea of, as we just discussed, the anatomy of melancholy is, and what he does in this particular work. Now, since it was about the world of melancholy and the various aspects of it, that is why it can be counted as an example of non-fiction. Now, while we were discussing about the various forms, we have discussed diary as one of the subgenres, or one of the ways of creating non-fiction. So here we are discussing about the diary of Samuel Pepys. So the diary by which Pepys is chiefly known was kept between his 27th and 36th years. So written in Thomas Shelton's system of shorthand or tachygraphy with the names in longhand, it extends to 1 lakh or 12 lakh 50,000 words, filling 6 quarto volumes in the Pepys library. So you can see the huge number of words which he has inserted into his understanding of, what a diary is, and filling 6 quarto volumes in the Pepys library. So it is far more than an ordinary record of its writer's thoughts and actions. It is a supreme work, that is a very good work of art, revealing on every page what the capacity for selecting the small as well as the large essential that conveys the sense of life. And it is probably after the Bible and James Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson the best bedside book in the English language. So it is far more than what? An ordinary record of its writer's thoughts and actions. And it is a supreme work of art which is revealing on every page the capacity of selecting the small as well as the large essential that conveys the sense of life. So what does it capture? It conveys the sense of life. And probably after Bible and James Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, the best bedside book, that is a book which you keep beside your bed just to read at any point of time in English language. So one can open it on any page and lose oneself in the life of Charles II's London, and of this vigorous, curious, hardworking, pleasure-loving man. So his world, that is the writer's world. So you can open it on any page and lose yourself in the life of Charles II's London. So a very, very realistic description of Charles II's London. A very vigorous, curious, hard-working, pleasure-loving man's account of Charles II's London. So Pepys wanted to find out about everything because he found everything interesting. Now, whose writing would you like? Somebody who is very interested in life and doesn't write anything interesting? Or you would like the, you know, account of somebody who is interesting or who writes down interesting things? Whose diary would you like to read? Yes? Anybody? Whose diary would you like to read? Somebody who is, who finds interest in everything and writes down them in their diary? Or will you be interested in reading the diary of somebody who doesn't find any interest in his or her life? Obviously, The answer will be about somebody who finds interests in everything and writes them down in the diary. So he never seemed to have a dull moment. He could not indeed understand dullness. So one of the more comical entries in his diary refers to a country cousin named Stanks who came to London with him in rather who came to stay with him in London. So Pepys had been looking forward to showing him the sights of the town. So this is one of the comical entries in his diary. So diary writing is something which, as we were discussing in the previous lecture, is something a common man also does. But how well you write your diary depends on your writing quality, creative quality, presentation quality. So we see that Pepys had that quality of creating interesting accounts, and one of the comical entries in his diary refers to a country cousin named Stanks who came to live with him in London. So Pepys possessed a journalist's gift of summing up a scene or person in a few brilliant, arresting words. So he used to use some brilliant, arresting words. He makes us see what he sees in a flash. His Aunt James, a poor, religious, well meaning, good soul, talking of nothing but God Almighty, and that with so much innocence that mightily pleased me, and his sister Paul, a pretty, good bodied woman, and not over thick, as I thought she would have been, but full of freckles and not handsome in the face. So, from these descriptions, we can understand how vividly he captures the real moment of that particular incident. So it is basically a scene or a person in a few brilliant asserting words, wherein Aunt James is represented as poor, religious, well meaning, good soul, talking of nothing but God Almighty, and that with so much innocence that mightily pleased me. And his sister Paul, a pretty, good bodied woman, and not over thick, as I thought she would have been, but full of freckles and not handsome in the face. So he could describe with wonderful vividness a great scene, as for example, the day General George Monk's soldiers unexpectedly marched into a sullen city and proclaimed there should be a free parliament. And bow bells and all the bells in all the churches as we went home were a ringing. It was past imagination, both the greatness and sadness of it. So, the language, if we read, we see that the language is really striking. So, he could describe with wonderful vividness a great scene. As for example, the day General George Monk's soldiers unexpectedly marched into a sullen city and proclaimed there should be a free parliament. And then goes on to say that bow bells and all the bells in all the churches as we went home were a ringing. It was past imagination, that is beyond imagination, both the greatness and suddenness of it. He described too restoration and coronation, the horrors of the plague, and the fire of London. Writing down his account, so strong was the artist in him, even as his home and his treasures were being threatened with destruction. So he described the restoration of the king and coronation of the king and the horrors of the plague, fire of London. Writing down his account, so strong was the artist in him, even as his home and his treasures were being threatened with destruction. So even when there was the threat of destruction at his own home for his own things, even then he was writing down these ideas very, very vividly. So, above all, Pepys possessed, that is, he had what? The artist's gift of being able to select the vital moment. So, he makes his readers share the very life of his time. So, I stayed up till the bellman came by with his bell just under my window as I was writing of this very line and cried, past one of the clock and a cold and frosty windy morning. So What did he cry? He cried past 1 of the clock and a cold and frosty, windy morning. So he had the gift of being able to select the vital moment. He makes his readers share the very life of his time. He tells of the guttering candle, which makes me write thus slobberingly, of his new watch. But Lord, to see how much of my old folly and childishness hangs on me, still that I cannot forbear carrying my watch in my hand in the coach all the afternoon and seeing what o'clock it is 100 times of being awakened in the night. So, about 3 o'clock this morning, I waked with the noise of the rain, having never in my life heard a more violent shower. And then the cat was locked in the chamber and kept a great mewing and leaped upon the bed, which made me, I could not sleep a great while. So we can see his description, we can see his writing style, how he describes the various incidents which are happening. So there can be incidents of you know, the coronation or the incident of restoration. It can be the incident of his some cousin visiting him, or about the guttering of the candle and what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning. So he excluded nothing from his journal. So everything about the his life which was happening around him was there in his diary. So we can actually think of the parallel wherein we see there are various vlogs nowadays wherein you are actually telling and reading out everything about your life to the people who are following you. Similarly, Pepys's diary was a basic note, a kind of bringing together of the entire facts and everything which was happening around him. So Pepys excluded nothing from his journal that seemed to him essential. However much it told against himself. He not only recorded his major infidelities and his weaknesses, he put down all those little meanness of thought and conduct of which all men are guilty, but few admit even to themselves. So he not only recorded his major infidelities and weaknesses, he put down all those little meannesses of thought and conduct of which all men are guilty, but few admit even to themselves. So he is frank about his vanity. As for example, in his account of the day, he went to church for first time in his new periwig. So a kind of wig which people during time which they could wear on top of their head, both men and women. So I found that my coming in a periwig did not prove so strange to the world as I was afraid it would, for I thought that all the church would presently have cast their eyes upon me. But I found no such thing about his meanness over money, his jealousies, and his injustices. So, home and found all well, only myself somewhat vexed at my wife's neglect in leaving her scarf, waistcoat, and night dressings in the coach today, though I confess she did give them to me to look after. So, for he possessed in a unique degree the quality of complete honesty. So, his diary paints not only his own infirmities but the frailty of all mankind. So, he is talking about his incidents, the things which are happening, but through his follies, through his kind of infidelities and weaknesses, he actually is giving example of the frailty of the entire humankind. So, after the successful publication of John Evelyn's diary in 1818, Pepys's diary was transcribed with great accuracy by John Smith, later rector of Baldock, Hertfordshire. So, Pepys's diary was what? Was transcribed with great accuracy by John Smith, later rector of Baldock, Hertfordshire. Now, we are discussing the next writer, who is John Locke. So we see that when we are reading non-fiction, there won't be this very intriguing and interesting plot line. Rather, we have got different kinds of accounts of different people, and the language which is used are sometimes difficult for an easy understanding. That is why reading them in original and trying to understand their meaning is important, so that if some question comes from it we are able to answer them. And also the names, publication years when they were published, important concerns which have been communicated to us through them, we should be very, very sure about them as well. So John Locke remained in Holland for more than 5 years, 1683 to 89, while there he made new and important friends and associated with other exiles from England. He also wrote his first letter on toleration and published anonymously in Latin in 1689 and completed an essay concerning human understanding. So you can see that the very ideas and the topics are also something related to us, our existence. For example, about melancholy, which we just read. Now we are talking about an essay concerning human understanding, and then they are essays, they are not novels, they are not short stories, and with twists and turns, rather a very, very strict kind of understanding and analogy and a kind of reflection on a particular topic. So, a dominant theme of the essay is the question with which the original discussion in Exeter House began. So, what is the capacity of the human mind for understanding and knowledge? In his prefatory chapter, Locke explains that the essay is not offered as a contribution to knowledge itself, but as a means of clearing away some of the intellectual rubbish that stands in the way of knowledge. So, what is the main aim? The aim is a means of what? Of clearing away some of the intellectual rubbish that stands in the way of knowledge. So he had in mind not only the medieval scholastics and their followers, but also some of his older contemporaries. The scholastics, those who took Aristotle and his commentators to be the source of all philosophical knowledge and who still dominated teaching in universities through Europe, were guilty of introducing what? Introducing technical terms into philosophy, such as substantial form, vegetative soul, abhorrence of a vacuum, and intentional species, that among or that upon examination had no clear sense or more often no sense at all. So Locke saw the scholastics as an enemy that had to be defeated before his own account of knowledge could be widely accepted, something about which he was entirely right. So Locke begins the essay by repudiating the view that certain kinds of knowledge, knowledge of the existence of God, of certain moral truths, or of the laws of logic or mathematics, are innate, imprinted on the human mind at its creation. So the doctrine of innate ideas, which was widely held to justify religious and moral claims, had its origins in the philosophy of Plato, who was still a powerful force in 17th century English philosophy. So Locke argues to the contrary that an idea cannot be said to be in the mind until one is conscious of it. So only when somebody is conscious about the idea in their mind, only then it can be said that it is in the mind. So, but human infants have no conception of God or of moral, logical, or mathematical truths. And to suppose that they do, despite obvious evidence of the contrary or to the contrary, it merely an unwarranted assumption to save a position. Furthermore, travelers or people who travel to distant lands have reported encounters, that is discussions and meeting with people who have no conception of God and who think it morally justified to eat their enemies. That is, who have no conception, that is, no idea of God, and who think it morally justified to eat their enemies. So, such diversity of religious and moral opinion cannot be explained by the doctrine of innate ideas, but can be explained, Locke held, on his own account of the origins of ideas. So, he is talking about the various aspects of the human mind and how things work. So in book 2, he turns to that positive account. He begins by claiming that the sources of all knowledge are first sense experience, the red color of a rose, the ringing sound of a bell, the taste of salt, and so on. And second is reflection. So, first is what? The first idea is the idea of sense experience, and then number two is of the reflection, that is thinking about the sense experience. One's awareness that one is thinking, that one is happy or sad, that one is having a certain sensation, and so on. So there are not themselves, however, instances of knowledge in the strict sense, but they provide the mind with the materials of knowledge. So Locke calls the materials so provided ideas. Ideas are objects before the mind, not in the sense that they are physical objects, but in the sense that they represent physical objects to consciousness. Here, I would like to refer to Plato's idea of how reality is created, how imitation, and what we see around us is an imitation of the ideal, which we have discussed when we have taken up literary criticism. So Plato's description and then Aristotle's description can be referred to, wherein he is saying that ideas are objects before the mind, not in the sense that they are physical objects, but in the sense that they represent what? That is, they present physical objects to consciousness. They present the physical objects to the consciousness of the mind. The other work of Locke, which is worthy of consideration, is Two Treatises of Government. So, Two Treatises of Government, major statement of the political philosophy of English philosopher John Locke, published in 1689, but substantially composed some years before then. So, he wrote this work, that is Two Treatises of Government. So, the work may be considered as a response to the political situation as it existed in England. So, we have to remember that when we are talking about non-fiction, it is about reality. It is about the things which are existing and the situations which are there. So, this work, Two Treatises of Government, is also a response to the political situation as it existed in England during that time, when the time of the exclusion controversy. Now, what is that? The debate over whether a law could be passed to forbid, that is, exclude the succession of James, the Roman Catholic brother of King Charles II, who reigned 1660 to 85, to the English throne. So, whether a law could be passed to exclude, to stop the succession of James, the Roman Catholic brother of King Charles II, to the English throne, though its message was of much more lasting significance. So, Locke strongly supported what? John Locke supported exclusion. In his preface to the work composed at a later date, he makes clear that the arguments of the two treatises are continuous and that the whole constitutes a justification of the glorious revolution which deposed James, who reigned as James II from 1685 to 1688, and brought the Protestant William III and Mary II to the throne. So we see that this treatise is about the political situation, about Locke's understanding, his idea of exclusion as it is put up in the treatise. So it should be noted that Locke's political philosophy was guided by his deeply held religious commitments. So his philosophy was guided by what? By his deeply held religious commitments. Throughout his life, he accepted the existence of creating God and the notion that all humans are God's servant in virtue of that relationship. So, existence of creating God and the notion that all humans are God's servants in virtue of that relationship was something which was accepted. So, God created humans for a certain purpose, namely to live a life according to his laws, and thus to inherit eternal salvation, most importantly for Locke's philosophy. So, God gave humans just those intellectual and other abilities necessary to achieve this end. Thus, humans, using the capacity of reason, are able to discover that God exists, to identify God's laws and the duties they entail, and to acquire sufficient knowledge to perform their duties and thereby to lead happy and successful lives. So they can come to recognize that some actions, such as failing to care for one's offspring or keep one's contracts, are morally reprehensible and contrary, that is, going against to natural law, which is identical to the law of God. So other specific moral laws can be discovered or known only through revelation. So the essentially Protestant Christian framework of Locke's philosophy meant that his attitude toward Roman Catholicism would always be hostile. So, what we have to take note of is that it is about his religious beliefs and what he considered as, the right thing. So, he rejected the claim of papal infallibility. That is, how could it ever be proved? And he feared the political dimensions of Catholicism as a threat to English autonomy, especially after King Louis 14 of France in 1685 revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted religious liberty to protect or Protestant Huguenots. So, we have kind of discussed some of the important areas of this particular topic today. We discussed about the post independence era of India and the different subgenres, ideas of how travelogues, diaries, and essays played an important role in bringing out a trajectory of non-fiction writing. We took up some of the important works. In the next lecture, we will again take up a few other important works which need to be covered in our studies. But other than that, what we have already said, that you should try to make a list of the important travelogues, important autobiographies, important diaries, uh, important biographies. So the division, which the chart which I have described and kind of shared in the class, keep that chart in mind and try to keep on adding on to the specific examples of each for a better understanding and for a better, a chart of things which you need to remember. So with this, we will come to an end of today's discussion. If you have any questions, then you can ask me in the chat box since it's a live session. If not, then you can connect with me later on. My details are given in the very first slide of my PPT, which I had shared as we started with the lecture. You can refer to that and contact me on my YouTube channel, which is Krishna's Canvas. Anything right now, you can write it in the live chat box. And if not, then we will call it a day. So have a great day. Thank you all of you for joining in.